This is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and today I'm here with Fern.
Hi, Fern Chapman, the author of Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, Sibling, Estrangement, and The Road to Reconciliation. And I'm looking forward to today because I'm very familiar with some of the topics we're about to discuss. Blaming, shaming, and baiting.
Absolutely. This is going to be a great episode because I think that this is something that really needs to be discussed and brought forth with some of our public, because a lot of us have experienced this. A lot of us have experienced this notion of shame shifting. So this is going to be a very special episode that basically goes into that. And I know that you've been wanting to share something with regards to your own experience with this.
Well, you know, Ali John, I always tell you that sadly, I've been exposed to way too many narcissists in my life. And as a result, I have the lived experience to share many of these concepts with you. So today, talking about blaming, shaming, and baiting, those are tactics of narcissists. And I always say, if you have one in the family, you have 10, because they seem to attract each other. You know, in my case, I had, for example, a stepmother who was a very big narcissist and difficult to get along with. And she was constantly baiting. And I remember having a confrontation with her at one point where I came forward and told her something I was upset about and I was angry about. And she started to attack me. And I said, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. I said, I'm upset with you about these things, but I'm not really clear on why you're upset with me. And she said, I'm angry at you because you're angry at me. Well, that kind of statement is so profoundly confusing. Wait a minute. I was upset. I was stating my feelings, and now you're attacking me. And I think that's kind of a practical example of what we're talking about. And the way I see it, and I came up with my own name for this, which I've shared with you in the past, and that is acid back. So basically, you know, if you put something forward and they feel it's acid, they throw it right back in your face. And it's very uncomfortable.
Of course, I think that that's obviously a strategy that they use to, of course, regain power. And I think that that's really important what you've mentioned there, because you really put us in the context of what this is, and I think it's going to be good for us to kind of give a bit of a definition or something that we can work with regards to what exactly shame shifting is. So, so basically a general definition would be basically that it's a familiar tactic rather, that's used by a perpetrator to shift the blame away from them and onto another person, quite simply. And that's usually the victim of the situation. So it usually serves a singular purpose, which is basically to take away power from the scapegoat or the black sheep that we all are, and back into the hands of the persecuted. So that's a working definition that we can have with regards to shame shifting.
Well, and from what I understand, a narcissist's ego is so fragile that they cannot accept any sort of criticism. And so what they have to do is get it off themselves and put it on somebody else. And that's how the shame shifting occurs.
Exactly. It's exactly like Teflon in some ways, but I think that, like we've talked about, I think that in the sibling estrangement context, I think that it's important to recognize that that we need to, of course, recognize the fact that there's a power struggle here with that particular toxic sibling that's happening there. So I think that shame shifting particularly gets into that, and I think that John Bradshaw illustrates it nicely, as a matter of fact, how this can play out in families. And he's actually come up with 7 rules that basically shame-based families tend to have. And he wrote this wonderful book about it called Healing the Shame That Binds You. And I think that we can talk about that in today's episode with regards to these 7 points. So how about if we get into it right now? So number 1 basically is control. That you have to be in control of all interactions, feelings, and personal behavior at all times. And as soon as a toxic sibling is going to come up, there's going to be something that comes up that's information that makes them feel uncomfortable, then all of a sudden, it's only a matter of time before the conversation shifts back uh, uh, towards the person that's denouncing the injustice and such and the inappropriate behavior. So that's one of the things that happens usually with a toxic sibling in particular, and they're very quick to assert their power position basically in families, and they usually know just how far they can get away with certain things. So disparaging remarks, screaming, bringing up embarrassing situations, for example. And this is basically just for them to take the negative spotlight off of them and to put it back on somebody else.
Yeah, generally a toxic pattern.
Yeah. So I think this is one of the things that a lot of us have probably related to. And we're wondering like what's going on here, that this is playing itself out. And this is usually one of the things that happens that is very much of a shame shifting type of approach. So,
And I think that a lot of people get caught in this because they are completely unaware of this pattern of relating. So, it's important to highlight exactly how this happens so that when you're in some sort of conversation or argument with one of these people, you can identify exactly what's happening.
exactly, yes. So I think that that's really important for us. That's why we're contextualizing it right now so we can pick up on it and recognize it when it happens. So number 2 is perfectionism. Always be right in everything you do. And people in particular families tend to have family members that live according to an externalized image that nobody ever really measures up to. So maintaining appearances can be very important, can be everything for that particular sibling that we have. So they can work extra hard at, basically trying to, of course, up themselves and maintain this false facade. And in exchange, all of us that are in this type of family can have the sense that we have to work extra hard at justifying ourselves all of a sudden to this imagined standard. So, and heaven help you if you don't, right? Because if you don't, basically, it just rains down on you. And I think this is a notion that a lot of narcissists, people that come out of narcissistic families tend to experience, is that they have to break away from that sense of conditional love that's often associated to perfectionism.
Well, I think we're all flawed and we all make mistakes. And if you're dealing with somebody who never feels they've made a mistake and never have to apologize, that's a red flag.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's it. Again, we're talking about unevenness. We're talking about what could potentially be a power struggle again with somebody that never apologizes. So very much something, yes.
And the flip side of that is if you're involved with somebody like that, there's no potential for growth. Because what happens is they're right, you're wrong, and it's going nowhere.
Yep. Reminds me of my own relationship with my sister.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that this is something that's important to watch out for. And I think it's good that we're talking about that. And I think that the third point also that can be helpful for us and our viewers to remember, of course, is the idea that whenever things don't turn out as planned, that all of a sudden you can be the one that gets blamed for something that's happened within that particular family or in the relationship with your sibling. Just like you said, they're right, you're wrong. So it's always easier to criticize than to take responsibility for it, right? I mean, that's the thing. And a toxic sibling, their modus operandi is always going to be to use what they know and what works best for them to assert their power. So it's kind of tragic when you think about it in a family, because in some families they'll promote the finger pointing by negating the siblings' inappropriate behavior, right? And they'll just basically downplay it by saying, "Oh, that's just the way they are," So you hear these type of things happen, and it really doesn't promote anything better. It just really promotes the status quo.
You're reminding me that, yeah, it's the excuse making that's so dangerous. When you start to hear somebody constantly justifying and making excuses for why someone behaves in an unacceptable way, that's another red flag.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's really important for our viewers to recognize this, and I think they'll probably see a lot of different experiences and examples that we mentioned right now in their own context. Something else to watch out for is what's called the denial of the 5 freedoms. And basically, this is to deny that you should perceive, think, feel, desire, or imagine the way you do. So basically, you're denied on those particular areas. And, our sibling relationships often feel dictatorial. They'll strive at all costs to keep things the way they are. Because, as you probably know, change is the enemy of any dictator or person who abuses their power, and this promotes the idea that their needs and wants are always more important than yours. Well, the danger for us is to actually internalize that image, that other people's needs are more important than ours.
And you have this huge setup if you were raised in a narcissistic family, because it was acceptable there, and now you're an adult and it's acceptable, it continues to be acceptable in the sibling relationship. Or for that matter, if you choose a marriage which replicates some of what you experienced in your home, it's acceptable until you become aware and say, this is not healthy.
Exactly. And I think that that's something that's really important, as you said there. And I think there's a few more points that we'll talk about that gets into that, because I think that the no talk rule especially is something else I think that needs to be mentioned, because you can't express any feelings, needs, or wants in a toxic sibling relationship. Because essentially what's going to happen is, we eventually learn that if you start to do that, well, it, as you said, acid back, starts to turn against you, get fed up, we shut down. So basically, we basically use this as a means to defend ourselves when we're faced with these type of situations with a particular sibling, because you're always left unfulfilled, and wondering at worst, what you've done to cause this. I mean, this is what all of us as empaths can potentially do.
And the ultimate in the no talk rule is estrangement, because you are rendered voiceless. You have no recourse. When somebody decides they're not going to engage with you, you can't even tell them why you're upset, because they've shut you down. And that's control, as you identified. And of course, that's part of this whole list that you're talking about.
Exactly. So I think that that's the thing too that's really important, is that, as we said, it's important that we recognize it has nothing to do with us, and we tend to personalize this, and it's important that we recognize this is simply a power game, and I think that that's the thing. It's a power game that gets played out through the other person. And again, if we learn to always keep our difficulties inside of ourselves, then basically it has a detrimental effect over time, as we've mentioned in past episodes.
Well, and the importance again of this is that you are aware enough so that you can avoid personalizing it.
Yep.
You understand that this is part of a toxic framework and it's not about you.
And that's one of the most important things to remember whenever we find other people going through this. This is why we do some of the forums. This is why we do our community, the support group on sibling estrangement, because of the fact that we need to break that stigma. So I think that's really, really important. So it leads us right into our next point, as a matter of fact, the idea of not making mistakes. Don't make mistakes. Mistakes reveal the flawed, vulnerable self. To acknowledge a mistake is to open oneself to scrutiny. So, we're more authentic people, being the black sheep in our families and such, we're very authentic. We're very clear about what happens, and, we tend to own up to our mistakes and acknowledge them. But the problem with that is, again, that can be used as fuel by a toxic sibling. And if we open our up to our faults like we do, the risk with that is that can be used against us. And in some cases, we can sometimes end up, at worst, mirroring some of the stuff that they do. So we kind of lower our standards and kind of, try to speak their language. And I think that that's a real danger that we can have, because if we start to do that with other people, that creates other problems for us, And I think it's important to recognize that we're flawed individuals, all of us, especially including the toxic sibling,
That's for sure.
So, yeah. So that's number 6, and I think at the same time it's important to mention our last point here, because I think this is again an important one to mention, because it's the after effects of all this, right? About what this can do to us if we're not aware of all this. And it's the idea that if you start to live long enough in a family, that is not basically tending to your needs, you can learn to internalize the idea that you don't trust anyone. So basically, it's a protective mechanism, but you shut down, and basically you shut down because you don't want to be disappointed. So that's the idea that can come out of a relationship based on unreliability with parents that aren't necessarily emotionally available, that can sometimes also manifest in toxic sibling relationships. It's important, of course, to recognize the fact that we want to have healthy relationships with other people. And I think that that's the whole issue, I think, with all of this, Fern, is that we don't want this toxic relationship we have with our sibling to breed mistrust for us, because it takes away from otherwise healthy relationships we can have with other people that can be based on consideration for ourselves and actually based on fun. So that's very healthy. That's what we want to have in our lives.
You know, the key, Ellie John, is really to recognize it. That's the beginning. And then you can start to see it in your sibling, maybe in your partner, maybe in your friends, because there's a tendency to constantly replicate those original relationships throughout your social system. And that's very dangerous. Now, having said all this, and it sounds like such a daunting task to become aware and make these grand changes in your life, I have to say that I've had to do that. And yes, it takes a lot of work, but I also think it makes you a much more textured person, because you understand who's out there and how they behave and how it affects you. And you gain the confidence to be more authentically yourself.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing that's really, really important, is once you have that basis for comparison, then all of a sudden things start to change. All of a sudden you're no longer a prisoner to this. And, you know, I know that we're already approaching the end of our talk for today, so we won't have the time necessarily to get into the what can we do's with this, but we'll leave that for our next session, of course. I think the what can we do's, we should take the time to look into that and perhaps contextualize that with some of our viewers. But I do think that
it'll be a much more practical approach as to how to deal specifically with these issues.
Yeah, I think it's better that way, that we do that, and we'll leave that for our next session. But I think that I think that there's a great quote that I'm going to paraphrase here from Dr. Ramani's book, actually, and I think that she really says it nicely, and I think it applies to us here. In Dr. Ramani's book, Don't You Know Who I Am, she repeats an important thought, and that thought is, and I'm going to paraphrase here, of course, don't fall into the trap of justifying yourself with your narcissist or toxic sibling in your life. They won't care. You'll wind up depleting yourself of your precious energy in hoping to make them understand.
Yeah, it sounds like a waste of time to me.
Yeah, exactly. And so long as we recognize that and we put our energies in the right place, then that's already taking a step forward. So.
Well, it's always great to talk about these things, and thank you. That was quite enlightening.
Well, I'm glad you were able to, of course, go through that with me and contextualize that, Fern, bring, of course, your experience into this. This is very important for our viewers to know, of course, how this is experienced, how this is lived, what they can do, and how they can best understand what to do now.
And more importantly, that you can get to the other side of it.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Fern, for being here. And we'll do this again.
Okay, thanks.
All right, take care.
Bye.